Hi, this is Michael Hinkson, and you are once again listening to Unstoppable Mindset. I'm really honored today to have Paige A. Riggins. We got to find out about the A, but Paige is a DEI coach. She has been very much involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion and helping in a variety of different ways in that environment. And I don't want to give much away because I want her to tell us all about it. But we're really excited. We've been working toward making this happen for a while, and I'm glad we finally did it. So, Paige, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
We're really honored that you are here. And I'd love it if you could start out by telling us just kind of a little bit about you growing up and starting out and all that kind of stuff, things that kind of give us some background.
Of course. So I was born in Oakland, California, raised in South Carolina, and I spent a lot of my time reading books, writing short stories in class, and just really trying to get a sense of self. But of course, in the teenage way where I am stressing my mom out probably every other day, which led me to really question like whether I wanted to even get into, being a teacher, which is what I ended up doing. And so a lot of what leads me now is just how I kind of spent my childhood, like exploring new things, learning new things, and like trying to figure out what I wanted to do in this life, which, that changes every other day, which is probably just as common for like other people. But my main route to just South Carolina, being around family, being able to just kind of chill and rest and relax and be successful, but like in my own way, and just kind of marching to the beat of my own drum as much as I can.
Do you think that makes you a risk taker? I mean, you like to explore and all that. Do you think that means that you do risky things, or that you are much of a person that takes risks to try to discover information and new knowledge?
That question is very interesting because it sounds like I'm a risk taker, and there are a lot of times when I am trying to think a lot more than I do. And so when people hear about my decisions or my advancements, they're just like, oh, wow, like that was really brave of you. When actually I was probably thinking about it for at least 6 months to a year before I even brought it up. And so I guess because I'm still taking the step, it is me taking a risk, but it's a risk that is like chaotic but ordered. So that I'm still having the risk, but I'm also still kind of like analyzing all the things that have to be true for this to go the way I want it to, or at least as close as to the way that I want it to.
Well, you thought about it a lot, as you just said. You thought for 6 months or a year, so it could still very well be a risk, but it's something that you thought about doing and just didn't generally leap into things. Have you ever just not thought about something and done it, or do you really like to think about things a lot before you do it? Because I think that makes a difference in, answering the question. In both cases, there are risks, but you've really thought about a lot of what you do before you do it.
That's a good question. The things that I did not really think about and I just kind of did was like getting a nose piercing, getting a wrist tattoo. Those were the things that I had to feel it in order to do it. And when I felt it, I got up, made the appointment, or I did a walk-in, and I just went to go do it. And so I think when it's things that I approach with my gut, those are the things that I just kind of go and I just do because I feel it in my heart that this is the moment.
You trust your intuition and your instincts.
I do. That leads a lot of how I handle things. Um, and it really leads even the way that I think, the way that I do my routines, because I try to go by what feels good for me.
Do you spend part of every day kind of thinking about what happened that day? Do you do introspection sorts of things to really analyze your world on a regular basis?
I do it at times. And there are times when introspection leads to overthinking for me. And
Mm-hmm.
so I have to like meter when is the point of no return where I'm going to get into overthinking and what is actual introspection for me. And so I usually have to um, do that reflection like on the car ride home.
Mm-hmm.
Once I get in my house, I have to just let it go, no
Mm-hmm.
matter what it was, and just say, you know what, this happened. This is how it was handled, or this is unresolved right now, and it's okay. Let me go light some candles, do something else.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that you can look at things and decide what happened, what worked, what didn't work. But at some point, you do have to give it up. You can't beat yourself up over it because that's not going to help anybody, especially you.
Oh no, I can't. I used to be that person where, if something wasn't perfectly the way that I wanted it to be, I would just kind of obsess over it. And then one day I said, actually, it doesn't really matter how that went because I am a different person from the other person. And if we had a misunderstanding or if we just did not agree, it's actually okay. And if that person wants to talk about it more, I'll be happy to, but I can't obsess over it either.
Yeah. So you said you were born in Oakland. Good for you. When did you move from Oakland?
So it's so interesting being born in Oakland because my mom, she was in the Air Force. And
Mm,
so that's where she was stationed. And we only stayed there until I was about 3 years old.
mm.
And she ended up getting stationed in Italy. And I don't remember much of it, but she's just like, you were able to learn Tagalog, you were able to like be around so many different cultures. And then once she got out of the military, we moved to South Carolina. And that's where I was raised. So it's like Oakland is a part of my roots, but the biggest part of my roots is South Carolina. I would love to
Uh-huh.
go to Oakland someday and just to kind of like be where I was born. Um, but yeah, that's the story of like Oakland and a little bit about Italy too.
I was just going to ask if you'd been back to Oakland, so you haven't really gone back to visit.
No, I have not. I don't know what's holding me back. I think that I have to. I think it's like if there was anything that I was overthinking, it's probably going back to Oakland.
Well, just think, if you're in Oakland, you're not far from San Francisco, which means you're not far from Ghirardelli Square and chocolate. Just pointing that out.
I'm not gonna lie, chocolate has to be one of the things that is my kryptonite. I need it and I should not always have it, but it's perfect.
Well, there's always Bowden sourdough bread, so we can come up with a lot of different options. But yeah, I lived for 12 years in Novato, so we were up in Northern California. We were in the what would be north of San Francisco, up in Marin County. So, however, been to East Bay and Oakland a number of times, and had a close friend who lived there, who just passed last year. But yeah, so I hope you do come back and spend some time touring around Northern California and having a little fun. The culture is great.
You know what? I'm gonna keep that in mind when I'm thinking about trips.
Well, it's worth doing. Well, so you lived in South Carolina, and when did you leave South Carolina?
I left South Carolina back in 2021.
Oh,
I was there from the time that I was around 4 Went to school there, all K through 12, even did my undergrad there. And I started working there as a teacher as well. So my roots run deep when it comes to South Carolina,
Good for
and it took
you.
a lot for me to leave.
Yeah. Well, what made you do that?
I wanted to change.
Okay.
Being a teacher is not the easiest, and during the pandemic, it was especially
Yeah.
hard. And I just realized that things were not as equitable as I thought that they were, or that I wanted them to be. And so it was either stay in that same place and not really be able to make a change in the ways that you want, or go somewhere where you can get the learning and then at some point come back.
So you did your undergraduate. Have you done graduate work?
I have. I went to Concordia University, and I studied curriculum and instruction. So I had my master's of education.
Oh, cool.
Yes, it was
See.
it was rigorous, but I loved it.
So, I heard a report this morning that said that because of the pandemic, students are generally close to probably one grade level behind where they really ought to be. I don't even remember who was reporting that, but do you think that's true, or how do we address that? Because this kind of thing can happen again. How do we not allow that to happen?
Well, I can definitely say that it is true. Even when I was a teacher, just kind of seeing, especially because kids are their own persons, like they are growing adults. And even outside of being grown adults, they're kids. And so they have their own emotions. They're going through the same emotional roller coasters that we were when the pandemic started, and as it continues now. And so I saw a lot of loss when it came to reading levels. And for me, one of the ways that I started trying to support students is really just starting to listen, which I did not always do. Trying not to hold kids accountable for the fact that they are still learning how to handle their emotions, which is a skill that even some adults don't quite have down pat yet.
Yeah.
And just kind of listening and seeing hey, how are you doing today? If they were having a bad day, asking them hey, take a breather, walk down the hallway, come back, and just trying to get the social and emotional learning in there, where it would help them to learn how to cope with those emotions and to name them for themselves. So giving autonomy where I could, within the classroom.
Yeah. And it is a challenge because kids are learning so much, or need to learn so much. My wife was a teacher for 10 years. I have a secondary teaching credential, but I never taught in a school, although I think I've done a lot of sort of professional teaching in other ways, but I've never taught in a school. She did for 10 years. She loved the little kids. She liked first, second, and third graders. She liked third graders especially. She said they were still young enough to really learn and old enough to start to really process, as opposed to older kids who were much more set in their ways.
I will say middle school educators are a special kind of people, because we tend to have to work with students who are really trying to figure out, who am I? And that question is just as hard as Algebra 1, just as hard as advanced grammar, when it comes to what kids are expected to learn. And I would say, yeah, middle school, it's so funny that she said that, because I met a lot of students who were not necessarily set in their ways, but they thought that they had to be like their parents.
Well, yeah.
Even if it didn't agree with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And intended to do that. Teaching is tough, and I think that teachers are so underappreciated on so many levels, and so it tends to be a real challenge. that
Oh, yes.
all of us have to deal with. And I really get so frustrated sometimes about how people don't really appreciate what teachers bring. And I listen to news reports about banning books in classrooms and the kinds of things that, well, parents should have a say in this. And when you really get down to it, they want to ban books they haven't even read, and they're just listening to what other people said rather than thinking and processing themselves.
Oh, I think the most unfortunate thing about teaching and the pandemic was watching a majority of people via social media like praise teachers and then go to really disregarding how teachers felt just as human beings, having to go and essentially become essential workers because they had to educate. They still had to be mandated reporters. They still had to care for themselves and their families and if they got sick. And then seeing how we're having what I've heard to be called culture wars when it comes to banned books. And it's really trying to understand, what are you trying to block kids from that they don't already know? I have heard some of the most profound opinions on race and gender and society from students just in an icebreaker question, a bell ringer. And it's like, you want to dampen that, and why?
Yeah. What do you think about this whole concept of what we are hearing called critical race theory?
I think that there's a big misunderstanding about critical race theory, because what people see as critical race theory when it comes to painting white people to be bad people is, no, it's not painting anyone to be bad. It's examining the actual historical context and how that disparaged groups of people based on the color of their skin, their socioeconomic status, and to reduce it to, we're just trying to make a group of people feel bad. It minimizes the reason why we should actually have factual information in schools, why we should actually teach students how to critically think about the world as it is, and not just critically think, but question it, because that's the only reason why we have half of the policies, laws, and practices that we have now, because somebody questioned, somebody was able to have the access to make a decision or to bring a collective of people together. And it's like to minimize children's abilities to question, like our predecessors did, is essentially just, leaving room for one truth to be told.
Yeah. And it tends to be so misunderstood in so many ways. I'm amazed that anyone would want to ban a book like To Kill a Mockingbird, having read it a number of times and hearing the things that people say, but then when you really drill down, they haven't read the book. And the result is they don't understand anything about what Harper Lee was saying in the book. And so it's so unfortunate that we tend to not be as thorough at researching things ourselves. We rely on someone, and well, we trust this person. Oh, we trust that person. Well, the reality is that there are a heck of a lot of people who don't trust this person or that person. And is there a reason for that? We really need to look at things for ourselves, and we don't as often as we should.
Yes. And I would agree, because going straight for knee-jerk reactions when it comes to what you think is in a book versus skipping over the entire reason for why a book was written, even books that are banned right now deal with anything that is not heteronormative, anything that is not outside of the norm in American society. And my question always, when the idea of like banning books comes up, is do you want kids to not be able to identify as their full selves? And if so, why is that while you were able to? So yeah.
And to expand the dimension, which I have done from time to time on this podcast, very rarely when we talk about DEI do we even get into the discussion of disabilities, even though there are more people with disabilities than there are any other minority, other than if you call women to be a minority, and although there are more women than men. But the reality is we don't include them. We don't include people with disabilities. We don't have discussions. If we're going to talk about reparations and other things like that, let's talk about how people with disabilities were, are, and probably will be treated for some time to come, because we're not in the conversation at all.
Yes. And I would even say, even living in Baltimore as it is now, it's not accessible. My mom, she's a disabled veteran, and she cannot live in most places in this city, because her power chair is going to need, like, elevator. It's going to need no steps when you're entering the building. And even in this conversation about culture wars, banning books, limiting how people can identify with historical context, that also leads to minimizing marginalized groups, especially when it comes to ability. And so I agree with you, because even with how we have conversations about equity, just in passing in school districts, a lot of the times accessibility is not even one of the things that comes up as a concern, even though not all disabilities are even apparent. You could look at somebody and not know what they have going on, and make an assumption that actually minimizes their identity and excludes them from decision-making and access.
Yeah. And it has been many years since I first heard this statistic I'm about to say, and it hasn't really changed much. The unemployment rate among employable people who are blind, and I think it's appropriate to say who have a physical disability, is in the 65 to 70% range. Even though we have a national unemployment rate of 3.4%, according to the statistics last Friday. And why is that? It isn't that we can't work. It is that people think we can't work, and they're not willing to explore, and they don't like something that's different from them, which also feeds into the whole race discussion too. But nevertheless, it's still the case.
Yes, I think that especially if people approached things that they do not identify with questioning, to understand, not just to respond, a lot of what gets minimized when it comes to the different social identities, there would be a space for people to be their full selves. Because, even when it comes to race, it's like, if I'm not the same as you, instead of looking at it as this is an opportunity for me to get another perspective, some people can view it as this is a threat to my personal safety. Even when it comes to ability, half of the outdated terms, half of the outdated laws and policies and practices minimize a person with disabilities ability to like access many of the areas that able-bodied people can access, even when it comes down to having conversations, having a seat at the table to make decisions about how their livelihood is affected.
Yeah. It's kind of the nature of the beast, and it shouldn't be, but we haven't learned to move beyond that yet as a society, within this country or anywhere else for that matter.
I agree.
So are you still teaching in the classroom today?
No, I am actually doing equity work. Excuse my background noise. I live right by the streets. But I do equity work. And in that equity work, I look at workplace culture and really just identifying what it looks like to implement structures of protection for marginalized identities.
So is this your own business now, or do you work for someone else to do that?
So the workplace culture piece, I have my own consulting firm called Culture of Equity Consulting. And then I also work within a school district when it comes to educational equity, when it comes to race.
Well, hopefully we'll get to help you make an expansion of that and deal with disabilities. But that's another story that we don't have to worry about today.
Look, you'll have to take that up with my supervisor. A lot of the times in school team meetings, we end up talking about intersectionally what happens for students outside of race, because race impacts a lot of students' lives. And when you add on ability, socioeconomic status, gender, nationality, those things shape how a student or a staff member can like navigate throughout the day, starting from like when they leave their home and when they return.
There's a lot to it.
It is. It's very multifaceted, very much. It sometimes feels like going down a rabbit hole of information where you start with asking a person one question about how they identify, and then you start asking, where do you live? How do you get to work or school? What is it like when you are engaging with people outside of your race? What does that bring up for you? And the questions can keep going on, which is both a strength and one of those areas that can stop a conversation, because you can learn a lot about a person. And if there is something that clashes with the part of your identity, that can bring the need for like having some type of structures of like protection, some type of parameters so that you both can care for each other, even if you're different, which is the whole point of the big focus on like equity anyway.
Right. We're all different in various ways. Sometimes it's very subtle, and so we don't tend to pay attention to it, but sometimes it's significant differences, whether it be race or sexual orientation or disability or ability. And some of those terms have to be changed. So I've been advocating that we need to recognize that disability isn't what we think it is. Disability isn't a lack of ability. Some people would say, but that's the word. No, diversity is supposed to be also celebrating difference, and it doesn't deal with disability. So, we can change what words mean, and we ought to do that. Disability does not mean a lack of ability. Disability is a characteristic. And I could make a strong case for the fact that you, Joe Biden, and let's come up with some younger politician, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She's a Republican who gave a speech Tuesday night, what I thought was kind of crazy, but that's my opinion. But nevertheless, all of you have disabilities. Your disability is you're light dependent. Lights go out. If you don't have access to a flashlight or a candle, you're in a world of hurt, or a smartphone. And the reality is that the invention of the electric light bulb covered up that disability for you. And there's so much technology that allows you to have light pretty much whenever you want. But nevertheless, the disability is still there. So we can make the case that everyone has a disability. And I bet we could come up with other things about any individual that would, from a relative standpoint or relativity standpoint, would make them have a disability over someone else. Short people have a disability that tall people don't recognize. Tall people have a disability that short people don't recognize when you're trying to fit into a crowded airplane seat, for example. There are all sorts of things that come up to the level of what we ought to call a disability, but we don't because we have an outdated definition of what disability really means.
And I would agree with that. And that's a really interesting take on how everyone has some way that like their life is altered by the way that they are made.
Mm-hmm. So you're now working in part in your own business and working with a Department of Education and so on. When do you do most of your work? Do you pretty much keep busy all day? When are you most productive?
Oh, so I am a morning person through and through. By the time that it is 7 p.m., the work part of my brain kindly goes to sleep so I can have time to just relax. I used to be one who would work until 9 and 10 p.m., but it wasn't humanity friendly. And so I had to figure out another way of just honoring myself. And even though like running a business and also working in a school district and also, being a friend, a partner, a sister, a daughter, all of those things, even a dog mom, all of those things require my attention too, and they're just as important as the work that I do. So having to balance is a little hard, but that's usually when I get my work done is like during the day, and by the time that it's the evening, I try to make sure that I have some kind of routine in place.
I had a guide dog. It was my sixth dog. Her name was Meryl. And I describe her as a dog with a type A personality. She would not leave, if you will, work at the office. Even when we were home and the harness was off, which was the time that she could relax, she had to follow me around. She wouldn't play with the other dogs in the house. And eventually, literally, that lack of ability to relax stressed her out. So she only guided for about 18 months, and then she just became totally fearful of guiding. And it was uncontrollable, and we had to retire her. So I hear exactly what you're saying. I think that it can be true for dogs as much as it is for people. This whole idea of being a workaholic is a real lovely thing to a point. But the reality is if we don't take time for ourselves, it can be a problem.
Yes. And I'm so sorry to hear about Meryl. I definitely, that was a big part of also why I had to figure out another capacity to support diversity, equity, and inclusion in the education field, because being a teacher, it really plagued my mental health, especially in the fall, because of course, by the time that it's 5:30, it is dark. And I am one who like really loves feeling sunlight. I love being able to like walk around and it not being nighttime quite yet, especially when the day started, and like, just very short days and very long nights. And so when I was not really digging into routines and I was like, still grading papers at home and lesson planning and never really giving time for myself, it caused a constant sense of urgency, a constant sense of needing to work, to where I started to feel like I was losing my passion in the profession, which is why I then had to switch over to, you don't need to grade papers in the evening. You don't need to take any work home for the weekend. You do your work during the week, and whatever's left will be there when you get back. And it was hard to switch over to that way of being, especially when sense of urgency and constantly doing is what is applauded in the education field.
Do you miss teaching, being in the classroom though?
I miss the children. I miss being able to see children start at one point of development in August and to come to be a whole different version of themselves by the end, and a better version of themselves too, for the ones who were at that point, and for the ones who were still questioning, just kind of seeing how they were like navigating life as a child who won't always have like, autonomy, especially in education where there's a bunch of like rules and like policies. And so I miss that. I do not miss the red tape on the classroom and all of the things that came with politics and how you like, respond to kids and parents and other colleagues and your administration. And it was just that for me took the joy out of teaching, especially when it was the height of the pandemic. It was a very stressful time.
Well, I have always loved being able to visit classrooms. My wife and I volunteered when we moved here to Victorville for our niece Tracy, who is a kindergarten teacher. She's now taught over 20 years. She loves kindergarten and loves
Wow.
being with the kids. Although every year we hear more and more about how some of the kids are having more and more challenges, and some of it comes from parents who did drugs and it's affected the kids and other things like
Mhm.
that. But she loves kindergarten. She just has a boatload of fun with it. And we went and volunteered for a few years and helped. But then, of course, with the pandemic, a lot of things changed. So now my wife has passed, so we don't anymore. But it's I hear what you're saying though, and the politics is such a problem. I suppose some people would say, yeah, but it's necessary. Well, I think we should look at how necessary it really is. But I remember some of my teachers. I remember the names of a lot of my teachers and remember some of them very well and the effects that they have had in my life and actually still correspond with some of them, which is really kind of cool. For 5 years ago, well, it's 5 years ago. My gosh, it is. Um, it'll be 6 in August, but I went to celebrate. We surprised him. My high school geometry teacher, who came to our wedding and who we've stayed in close touch with, went to his 80th birthday and surprised him. His kids were in on it, but I flew into Colorado and we just totally surprised him. Boy, that was fun.
Wow, that sounds wonderful. And definitely sorry about your wife. And I'm glad that you all got the chance to be able to engage with young people, especially in their element. I feel like
Yeah.
anyone who can teach lower and upper elementary, they have a special place in my heart because then those kids then come to middle school.
Yeah. Well, and now some of the children of some of those kids are in her class.
Oh, wow. I love
Yes,
that.
she
Full
was telling us that a
circle.
few weeks ago. She was telling me about that. That's pretty funny that she gets to have the kids of some of the kids that she taught.
But see, that all goes to impact and
Yeah.
being able to just kind of see like how I had this person when they were just a little person, and now they have their own little people, and they come back and they, one, want their kid to be in my class, and
Yeah.
two, um, they are here, and now I can help a whole nother generation go through that same process.
Who are some people who've had, from your perspective, major impacts on your life?
Definitely my grandmother who passed in 2018 and my mom. Um, both of them, one, my grandmother taught me just kind of how to be resilient, which was kind of to a fault because it took me a long time to really understand what it meant to relax and to not always talk about work. And so perseverance came from my grandmother, and from my mom, she just really allowed me to be the person that I was growing up to be. And she didn't want me to make mistakes, but I made them anyway, because I was as stubborn back then as I am now. And so just kind of those two women in my life showed me both sides of what it meant to be a Black woman in the South in America and what it was going to look like to be successful and just kind of like make your own way.
Now, you said your mom is in a power chair now?
She is.
Has she always been, or just that's recent?
No, she got hurt at work back when I was in high school. And so her journey through what it meant for sense of self, what it meant for access, movement, and how she was like, able to like actually navigate it shifted drastically for her. And it really made me understand how ableist most people are, including myself at the time, when it comes to just making space for what people may not have due to circumstance or biological means. It made me really question, what does it mean to like honor a person as their full selves without one, having pity, because pity helps no one, and also allowing them to have autonomy over what they need and what they don't need. She taught me a lot and still is to this day.
You can't do much better than that, Mom and Grandma.
Two staples in my life.
Well, take Mom to Oakland.
I want to so bad. She told me that I need to go, even if it's only once, because I'll be able to kind of get a sense of like where I came from. And I keep hearing how like Oakland has changed drastically, but I still would want to go, so I can at least give young Paige something.
It has. And also, it's become more accessible. You can ride the BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit. Mom could ride BART. Karen and I did. A lot of it is very accessible. I don't know whether there are inaccessible BART stations or not. Most everything, I think, is accessible, and they monitor you. We went on BART once. Karen had never been on BART. We were up in San Francisco. This is around the time we were married, or a few months before. And we went to a BART station later in the evening because she wanted to ride BART. So we pushed the button to get the elevator, and the elevator came. And I think they were listening to us in the elevator because we said, she said, we got to figure out where to go to deal with the accessibility part. And either somebody said on the speaker in the elevator, or as soon as we got off, they said, "Oh, you come this way." And it even gets better. So we got through and got to the train, got on the train, and the station person that we worked with tracked us. And he said, because we just said we wanted to take a ride and then come back. And when we got close to the next station, this voice comes over the speaker. "All right, this is where you're," because there was basically nobody else on the train. "This is where you get off, and I'll direct you as to where you go." And he just tracked us the whole way, which we loved. We didn't consider it spying at all. But Karen had a wonderful experience with BART because of that. Now, at that time, she was in a manual chair, but it wouldn't have mattered. She started using a power chair later. But she loved going on BART, and it was fun. I'd been on BART and used BART a number of times, but I never knew about the fact that they could track me, and I wouldn't mind if they want to do that. That's fine. But for her, it was great, and it gave her a wonderful experience and a lot of confidence. And she's had some other experiences with transportation. There's a lot of New York that's not accessible, but buses are accessible in New York. And she actually. We went back once before we moved to New Jersey, and we were at a hotel, and I had to go do some work, and she decided she wanted to go to the UN. She went downstairs, discovered that the buses were accessible, wheeled out to a bus, got on a bus, paid her fare, went to the UN, wheeled across, came back, bus picked her up, and there was a ramp that lowered, or I guess it was a ramp that lowered. She got back on the bus, went back to the hotel, and did the whole thing. There was a lot of it that was very accessible. Long sometimes, but she was able to do that. And she could have done it in a power chair as well. But again, at that particular point, she was using a manual chair. But I know New York is now talking about trying to make basically all subway stations accessible by 2050.
Wow.
And that's a job to do, because some of those I can understand why they're not accessible, but their commitment is to make them accessible, which is cool.
That is cool. And I think that also having like having someone who is watching allows people to have more autonomy, to not, like, have to rely on anyone coming with them if they just simply want to have like their own solo adventure. Mm-hmm. And I love that.
Mm-hmm. And it seems a reasonable thing to do. So I'm glad she had those experiences. We missed being married 40 years by 15 days when she passed. So a lot of memories.
Oh my goodness. That is an admirable amount of time. And I know that you honor her memory every day.
That is the plan. Well, you have obviously learned a lot, and you have worked on both sides, if you will, of the teaching process. Although, if I were to think about you a little bit, I'd say you're always learning. So you're always looking for good teachers in what you do, because we never stop learning, or we shouldn't anyway. But for you, what do you think the most important personality trait is, or what are some important personality traits that you think someone needs to have if they're going to do your job or be in the kind of field that you're in?
So it kind of goes back to the question about risk taking earlier. You have to be adventurous enough to be okay with making mistakes. And along with that, curiosity is one of the biggest personality traits I would say that you need. So like risk-taking, curiosity, and humility. Because I think at no point did I ever feel like I've arrived. And that's how I'm able to still keep doing what I'm doing and to keep learning. Like, even with this call, learning a new perspective on like how disability can be viewed as not like, not just a lack of something, but it's just everyone's way of navigating through society is different based on different characteristics. Like thinking of a disability as a characteristic is something that I did not even think to know. And that's purely off of curiosity. So like if anyone were to get into education or consulting or just equity work in general, I would say, please learn how to take risks, learn how to be curious, and always have humility.
Definitely great traits. My parents, I've often said, were risk takers, because when I was born and it was discovered I was blind a few months after being born, my parents were told, send him to a home for handicapped kids, because no blind child could ever grow up to do anything. And they disagreed with that. And they said, well, of course he can grow up to do whatever he chooses to do. And they had to have taken a lot of risks to allow that to happen, to allow me to ride a bike when we were living out here in California, or just to walk around the streets of the south side of Chicago when I was 3 and 4 years old, and things like that. And so there were a lot of ways that they took risks, and I'm sure that they, like you, thought about it a lot, but they also decided they couldn't not do that. They had to allow me to explore, or how would I learn?
And I love that they not only didn't take what someone else said, but they said, we're actually going to just lean into learning new things about how we can support our child. Because look at you now.
Yeah, look at me now. Right. Well, no, I hear what you're saying. And, we are all the product of our parents and those around us and the choices we make. And it's important that we always think about those things.
most definitely. Even when I think about like my grandmother and my mom and like what my grandmother taught me and what my mom continues to teach me, all of that came from, especially my mom, taking a risk on knowing that she was raising her children, meaning me and my younger sister, differently, and that it wasn't going to always be viewed as a good thing because we were taught to be more curious, more outspoken.
Did you have a dad in the process anywhere?
I had my dad for a little while. We are distant now, and it's of no consequence outside of just human things that happen. I think that the biggest thing that I'm really having to kind of grapple with now is that even when adults become parents, that does not mean that they still don't have their own personal journeys to go on. And that can sometimes impede on being a parent or being a son, a brother, a cousin, an uncle. And that it's actually okay because their journey is just going to look different right now.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what they need to do, as long as they do it and they do it well.
Right. Definitely heavy on the well part.
Yeah, well, there is that. Yes, there's always that. Something I've asked occasionally on this podcast of people, if you had the ability to go back and teach or tell your 18-year-old self something, what would it be?
I would tell her to find out her best qualities and then to write down everything that she thinks is not right about herself and to just ask herself why. Just think about what has made you feel this way about yourself. Because I think if even back then, if I had sat and like really thought about what I didn't like about myself, it would actually be everything that society told me that I should not like about myself instead of what I didn't actually like. And so I would tell her to just think about that and start to accept more of who she was because she was going to turn out to be pretty okay.
What were some things that you didn't like about yourself that you could go back and tell your 18-year-old person about?
I think definitely I probably wouldn't have been as bossy. And I would have definitely embraced a lot of my dialect from like being in the low country of South Carolina and really embraced the way my mind worked when it came to being creative and like writing short stories, which I still do now for fun, but it's just if I had not dampened that when I was younger, thinking that I had to go be something else, I would have definitely wanted to like change that and to just kind of embrace being a Black woman in the South. Yeah.
Would you tell her not to wait so long to go to Oakland?
I definitely would. I would
good.
say, okay, I know this is going to sound far-fetched, but can you put aside some money from your job at Pizza Hut and actually go ahead and keep that money until you're like a little older and then go to Oakland. And she wouldn't have understood what I was saying, but she probably would have still did it anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's always fun to have adventures to look forward to.
Yes. Yes, it is.
I don't know when or if it'll happen again, but I'd love to go on a cruise. Now, logistically, we'll see because there isn't someone right now to go with. I don't know. A lot of people cruise alone, but cruising, have you ever cruised?
I have not. I am still grappling with what it's like to be out in the middle of the ocean and have to like relinquish control.
Oh, it's a lot of fun and it's safe.
I might have to try that at some point. I have to figure out where I would want to go though.
Well, yeah, you got to figure that out too. I suppose you could cruise to Oakland through the Panama Canal, but at least get to San Francisco.
Yes, that would get two things done at once.
There you are. See, well, it is so much fun to do retrospective things like what you tell your 18-year-old self and so on. But if you found somebody who's starting out doing what you do, what would be some advice that you'd give them to help them along?
I would tell them to take in as many perspectives as you can when you're in the work, and also trust that what you're feeling in your gut is exactly what you need to hear and what you need to do. And so if you're coming into this work and you realize that you got to pivot and you have to do something else in this field or in the world of consulting, then do that thing and be confident in what you have to do for yourself. Because caring for yourself is going to take you a lot farther than trying to ignore what you need in the pursuit of success.
Got to really deal with your own personality.
You do.
It's important
and to
do
embrace all of it. What actually comes with your personality.
Have you always wanted to be in a field related to diversity, inclusion, and equity, or however? Or is that something that you adopted over time, or, because you taught and you obviously enjoy doing that and so on, and what you're in now, although you're working with the Department of Education, it's a little different than what you were doing when you were teaching, I would think.
I would definitely say that even when it came to teaching, I didn't always want to teach. It really wasn't until I started to just kind of see inconsistencies, even when I was in grade school, and when I graduated from high school, that was after the murder of Trayvon Martin, and it really started to make me think, what was the difference between he and I when it came to becoming a hashtag. And all throughout college, I went to college for writing for print and digital media, short-term journalism. And even though I loved meeting new people, interviewing people, it still did not feel like what I wanted to be. And so I would say that reaching young children in the world of like reading and English language arts, and then pivoting to also do diversity, equity, and inclusion work alongside teaching, it used to seem kind of out of the blue until I always think back to that moment where I asked myself that question once. I initially heard the news about Trayvon Martin. And so just kind of coming to a point where I was faced to like deal with race and other aspects of a person's identity, especially with this being after my mom lost the ability to like walk on her own. Yeah. And having to like really grapple with what does it mean for someone to be able to have access and navigate throughout society equitably. And that's really what not only led to teaching, but then to also working in a school district focused on equity, and then also doing my own work around workplace culture and ensuring that people have different structures of protection for their marginalized identities. It all kind of seems like puzzle pieces that fell into place, even as I'm talking to you now.
I think that's an interesting way to put it, that they're all puzzle pieces, and it all goes back to you made choices that led to other choices that led to other choices to do what you're doing. And you sound like you have no regrets.
Oh, no, none at all.
Which is
Even in the
great.
moments when education definitely made it seem like the world was just crashing down around me. There was no choice that I have not made that I have regretted.
And that's good. You've obviously given a lot of thought to all of that, and it helps you move forward. Have you done any writing, blogs, or books, or anything?
Right now, I do have a newsletter called Shifting the Culture. It's on LinkedIn. People can find it via my professional LinkedIn page, but that's where I put my writing to use when I'm talking about workplace culture right now. And as far as just using my writing skills, I do my own short stories for fun, just to flex my creative muscles.
Good for you.
When I get the chance.
Well, if you get enough of them, you can put them into a book.
You know, I just had a friend say that the other day, and that thought kind of scares me a little, but I guess that'll be the next risk that I take at some point.
Consider it an adventure.
I'll think about it that way because it scares me when I think about it as a risk.
Well, if people want to reach out to you and maybe contact you or whatever, how do they do that? And what is your LinkedIn page? We'll put those things in the notes, but at the same time, tell us any contact information that you'd like to do right now.
Sure. So if people want to reach out to me, you can either email me at contact@cultureofequityllc.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. My name on LinkedIn is Paige A. Riggins. And just to kind of circle back to the A stands for Ariana. But I really I always include it. And then people will ask, are there multiple Paige Riggins in the organization? No, I just like A lot. But those are two ways that people can find me.
Spell Paige A. Riggins and so on.
Sure. So Paige, Paige, A, and then Riggins, Riggins. And just for my email, that is contact, CONTACT at Culture of Equity LLC, CULTUREQUITY.com.
There you go. Well, I hope people will reach out. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion as far as I am concerned. And I do hope that you listening out there felt the same. We got to cover a lot of different areas today and went far and wide in discussions. And that's what really makes Unstoppable Mindset so much fun. And Paige, I really appreciate the stories and the insights that you bring to it. And I hope we can do this again.
Of course. And thank you so much. I love this conversation. And I just appreciate what you brought to the table when it came to your perspective. And thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you. And for all of you, when you're listening out there, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you rate podcasts, especially if you're on Apple and iTunes, because those are the numbers that people tend to pay most attention to. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Please email me, Michael, Michaelhi, at accessibe.com, or visit our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. Love to hear your thoughts. Want to hear what you think. And again, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. And I'd love to chat with you. If you need a speaker to come and speak at any events that you might be planning or need someone to come and motivate, let me know. Would love to explore that with you. And again, Paige, one last time, thank you for being here and being with us today.
No problem. Thank you all so much.